Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back once again to Samuel Adams Returns. Those anti-federalists, they absolutely got it correct. This is Tom Navolis, your host, but most importantly, I want to talk about the topic of refusing history. Now, I know a number of you out there may have heard of the quote of those that do not learn their history are prone to repeat it. What I have to say, and what I have been observing lately, is that it's not just, and so let me stop. So it's not just that the schools are not teaching history. I think that's true also in the church. I think it's true in the halls of Congress, in your state legislature. It's everywhere. We have rejected history in so many ways that not only are we doomed to repeating it, but as I heard, and I'm going to bring this up more in the second segment, as I heard a extremely prominent pastor out of California on the Babylon Bee make theological determinations and statements against other Christian pastors in a very passive way, no names, so I will not say any names here, but citing different truths that I call truths that he dismissed from his position as this eminent California pastor. He dismissed all that because I do not believe he understands even church history unless it validates his suppositions. Now, we all do that. Many people. We all take and we look at the different facts that we read, and we determine what they mean to support our supposition. That's not how we're supposed to approach history and Bible teaching in particular. So with that, today's topic is none other than forgetting history, refusing history. More importantly, refusing history to create whatever it is we're creating now. And I'm going to talk about that shortly, but in reference to what is happening, and this is part of treason in America, and that being a book that I'm going to bring in front of you shortly, is that nothing is new under the sun. And when we don't understand our history, our foundational history, our biblical history, then we miss so much of how to properly move ourselves in self-governance, as well as our nation in a governed manner that we were asked to do by our founders, and in particular by the anti-federalists. So here, what I'd like to open with is first off the fact that the Hunter Biden case, if you were following it, he ended up pleading not guilty, and there's references at samueladamsreturns.net for you to go look at, or if you've already read through some of the Breitbart articles in particular, that the whole plea deal was rejected fundamentally by the judge, and then it all fell apart in the courtroom between the prosecutor and the defense counsels. Now, it's interesting to note in one of the articles, and I'm just going to highlight it, I'm not going to get into the details of it, but that one of the prosecutors is a family friend, and that prosecutor actually worked for Joe Biden when he was in the Senate. how can someone so closely tied to family of the criminals be a prosecutor that is going to investigate the criminals that that person is very much tied to? Read the article. Very interesting. But that's not new. But it all comes down to finally where we are with a lot of the independent media that is out there. If very few, of course. There's not a lot. There's a few. It comes down to this. This is starting with an anti-federalist number one, talking about it being a dangerous plan, and it was written by a federalist. This was November of 1787. Goes on to say, I'm pleased to see a spirit of inquiry burst the band of constraint upon the subject of the new plan for consolidating the government of the United States, as recommended by the late convention. If it is suitable to the genius and habits of the citizens of these states, it will bear the strictest scrutiny. Here's the important key of your role. And many people who reject history are lazy in all of this, the strictest scrutiny, but more so, the people are the grand inquisitor who have a right, and it's in capital letters here, a right to judge the merits. The hideous demon of aristocracy has hitherto had so much influence as to bar the channels of investigation, preclude the people from inquiry, and extinguish every spark of liberal information of its qualities. At length, the luminary of intelligence begins to beam its effulgent rays upon this important production, the deceptive mist cast before the eyes of the people by the delusive machinations of its interested advocates begins to dissipate, as darkness flies before the burning taper. And I dare venture to predict that in spite of those mercenary determinants and decatimers, the plan will have a candid and complete examination. And it goes on. What I wanted to take and bring this quote to you is that you are the final arbiter, and that everything that is happening in the media is no different than what happened in 1787. The aristocracy that we will be talking about in Treason in America, they too have been around since the beginning of this nation. And you must clearly understand that it was only 1/3 true patriots who fought and brought together the concepts of independence from the slavery in so many different ways that all the people, all the colonies, not what the southern colonies had in human slavery from the African continent, but the slavery over all of the colonies in general because of the violation of these aristocrats. Oh, now we can say the aristocrats are what? The Davos crowd. No different. And in so many different ways, what we're going to take a look at is their hereditary backgrounds from this book that I found. In fact, I found it at the Dollar Tree, or was it a used bookstore? Occasionally I go to used bookstores and I look through for something, and this happened to intrigue me, and I picked it up a while ago and have been refreshing myself with it. And we'll talk about that in the third segment. But it is important to understand the Hunter Biden case and what is happening with President Trump as a devised plan through those oligarchs and those aristocrats who want to continue the modern mercantilism, which I've talked about in the past, and the modern slavery of a people that they can contain and control. I am including in the references a interview of Jim Garlow and his ministry, where he shows that what is happening to President Trump is happening on a global scale, that those political individuals willing to stand up in truth, not that they're perfect, as Dr. Garlow says, but in truth, are being persecuted in exactly the same way. It is a global pattern that is happening to President Trump and anyone else that will stand up politically for liberty and freedom according to foundational truth. So we have to look at what I opened with. And that quote is there at samueladamsreturns.net in the program newsletter for this week. It takes us in and helps us focus that, once again, you have that great responsibility to be the final arbiter. You must do your homework. If you want to save this nation, is it worth in the first place? There's polls out there that millennials in particular, and the majority of the Democrats don't even think you should have First Amendment rights anymore. They absolutely believe that there needs to be a Department of Indoctrination, and not only that, there needs to be censorship. We'll kind of talk about that a little bit in the third segment, because that is historically the direction that these oligarchs, these aristocrats, have been wanting to go for a long, long time. So the menacing cries for rigid government, it matters little to them of what kind it is, provided that it has a description. As a plan now offered comes something near to their wishes and is the most consonant to their views of any that they can hope for, they come boldly forward and demand its adoption. We're seeing that in every aspect of UN globalism, everything you have with transgender, everything that you have with all of the eco-freak stuff, I'll just call it that, environmentalism. It is right now, all of those fit into that pattern, come from this at the very beginning of the nation and say, yeah, they're out there, they're demanding its adoption. And boldly, the enemies of the people are more bold than they have ever been. And Dr. Garlow brings that out as well. They are zealots in what they want. They want the rigidness of government. They have no understanding and do not care to, because they do not want what was supposed to have been designed for us. So they are using everything, and they being the aristocrats, all of that which I already discussed, to their benefit. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have a lot more to cover as to don't even care about history, not even destroying history, ignoring history, purposefully ignoring history. Are you doing that? I know some young people that say, oh, I don't want to know anything about that young stuff, that history stuff from way back in the founding period, because, I just want to know what's going on right now. Well, if you know what's going on right now, that even that little bit of history, what's it going to mean for the future? Ladies and gentlemen, Sam Adams understood his history. How about you? come on back for the next segment when Sam Adams returns. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to this last segment, or actually it's the second segment of Samuel Adams Returns, those anti-federalists. Got it right. Boy, I'm jumping ahead of myself. Sorry about that. But what I wanted to cover in this segment is the refusal of modern pastors, whether they have pastored for 50 years in a church in California. 50 years, I would have expected them to, somewhere along the line, really read church history, really read the history of the pastors and the messages, the sermons of the pastors of the founding era. I can tell you from listening to this very prominent California pastor on the program with the Babylon Bee that he has not done that. Because if he did do that, he could not reject this Samuel Cheever's, see, I locked in on Samuel Adams, Samuel Cheever's sermon on God's sovereign government among the nations asserted that this in itself is such an amazing history lesson. I brought this sermon up to you last week and told you that I'm going to be somewhat modernizing it. And there's not a lot there except giving you some definitions that people are not familiar with the words as they were used at that time. And once again, I am using Webster's 1828 dictionary to define the words, not the modern dictionaries that are out there. But as I go through and look at what needs to be potentially edited or highlighted, I am doing highlighting in here that I think is important for anyone to look at because you can easily miss it. It is history. Summarize this 21-page sermon is a lesson in history, biblical history applied. And we do not do that for the most part. Now, the pastor from California, who in a innocuous way attempted to discredit other pastors and a particular pastor in a mountain state, if you will, tried to discredit him in what he has learned and read in history applied and is bringing that forward. It comes down to then what are they really theological differences? Or are they preferences of ignoring truth or applying the truth for the, I don't know, it's hard to say. It could be for the benefit of whatever is happening in some denominational perspective. A lot of that is happening. You have so many leftist churches out there that are ignoring not just the history of the church and Scripture, but ignoring the Scripture itself. So what I wanted to focus on are 2 points that Reverend Cheevers is making in this sermon. 2 of them are very critical to our history and understanding that sovereignty of God. So my assessment of listening to, and I've listened to this pastor a number of times. There's times I believe he is so spot on when he stays focused on the salvation message. But when he goes outside of that, in fact, his church made terrible mistakes by shutting down and following all of the orders of the government until all of a sudden they decided that there's nothing there, that this is all a lie, and then ends up in a major lawsuit that they ended up winning. But the fact of the matter is he didn't see it first, unlike this Mountain State pastor who saw it immediately for what it was and stood on the true principles of God's truth. So, not to belabor that, let me take you back to this history of God's sovereign government among the nations asserted, period. So point number 2, actually, that Cheevers makes is this: as God is the maker of the nations, so all the motions of the nations are all ordered by God from one part of the world to another. We get so myopic. Everything is America, 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 and your state, whatever it is. And that's it. Your town, that's all you see. I've had the privilege to travel and see many nations around this world. And I can tell you that it is factually true that God puts all the motion in the nations, and he orders it all everywhere. He owns it all, establishing from the beginning, as I talked about last week, that absolute sovereignty of Christ as Lord over the earth now. Now. Not in the future. Now. He is Lord of all now. A lot of the churches don't get it. Our California pastor doesn't get it. A lot of those in government don't get it. Many don't get it. And there's more in this sermon that is there in relationship to that, and it is not man to direct his steps. It is God that directs our steps. Point number 3. Not to belabor it all, but I think this point right now is where we'll focus for the moment. This point is, all the changes that happen among the nations are all overruled by this God and Lord of all. It is the great God who doth mostly certainly order all events and issues of affairs, to which men and second causes may be unknown and unexpected, yet so brought about that no man can always foresee or prevent God's peculiarness in himself as Jehovah. He doesn't change. This is critical to understand, is that then what we have Cheevers saying is that changes and war are against me, is what Scripture has to say, is very applicable to nations. Here is the home run in section 3. God sometimes blesses a nation with a great deal of prosperity, some considerable time. At another time, vexes them with all manner of adversity. And then he goes on to give various examples. It comes down to, as well in this section 3, is how much of God's sovereignty is seen in this manner in the times of Judges, and the land is decimated. And a lot of it is because the people walked away from the truth of God. This is the examples in the history of Israel. What is it that you worship? I've talked about that in many other programs. It comes down to political theology, my friends. Political theology is the essence of who and what is your God or gods. How many gods do you have? What is it you worship? What is it that is important to you that you spend your time and money there? How much of God's sovereignty is seen in this manner, again, in all that you should be doing? And where is it that God interjects I saw a photo. I think I am putting it there in the newsletter, is the photo of the funnel cloud right over the top of the Capitol. It's interesting. As I've mentioned before, is that, yes, the living God does own the wind. He owns every aspect of creation. And those pastors that are not willing to take and say that God can judge every nation, every person right now, are foolish. They do not understand the God of the Bible. So with that, we must take a look and understand these concepts. I do have a couple moments here that I will take you to. Point number 4 is that the government of the nations is most certainly ordered by this God and Lord of all, as God made all the nations of one blood. I thought this was very interesting, because right now, and we have for the last 50 years, had all of these ideas of segregation, and we've had all of these ideas of, what do they call it, prejudiceness and some other terms, and you have all of these racial issues going on. But I've heard, and not to accredit too much into one political figure, but one political figure in the stump speeches that he was making was say that we all bleed one color because we are of one blood. And this is how we were created. All nations go back to Noah after the flood, but prior to that, all nations go back to Adam and Eve, all of one blood. We all do bleed red. I thought this one point here was also interesting, and to say that when Israel was in Egypt, that what happened there is that in just 200 years, that the numbers of young men and adult men, and I believe it was from the age of 20, that they grew to exceed 200,000 people, just the men between 20 years old and into their fighting ages. That does not include all of the women and children under 20, young men under 20. So when you think about the population of the earth and what happened and how it was repopulated from the time of Adam and Eve, from the time of Noah, and within 200 years, that's what happened there in Egypt. Look at what has happened in America, excluding all of the illegal immigration. Talking about that right now, since Biden has been in office, the population that he has allowed illegally into this country exceeds that of the Dakotas and Hawaii together. Amazing. Well, I'm not going to belabor that. But the point that I want to drive home here as I finish off this section before we get into the treason in America is that history is not even wanted, even from the pulpits. This sermon alone would give enough history to say that, wow, that pastor up there in the mountain states has something interesting to say. Because also what that pastor from California is doing is rejecting Samuel Cleaver's sermon here on God's sovereign government among the nations exerted. I don't know where you are with all of that, but I highly recommend that you understand God's sovereignty among the nations, in and over this nation. Find out who and what your gods are and reject them, tear them down, and turn back to the living God of the Bible. See you in the third segment. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to this last segment of Samuel Adams Returns. Those anti-federalists did get it correct. And I do appreciate that you listen to my monologues. I haven't had a lot of guests on lately because it's just been so busy for Kath and I and all that we have going on. We did Liberty Camp, or I did Liberty Camp again this week in Geauga County, Ohio. Once again, I will say that that is something that I would highly recommend that you figure out for your own location, and that it is a great program. Just go to libertycampusa.com, libertycampusa.com, and contact Linda O'Brien if you have any interest in that whatsoever. It's quite the commitment to be able to put a program like that together, but it impacts the lives of second graders through seventh grade in such a manner that is very hard to describe. But it is a commitment. But like anything that is worthwhile, it's a commitment. Even like ignoring history, destroying history, taking and just letting history become meaningless, to ignore history, such as the quote goes, to the extent that those who do not know their history are doomed to repeat it. Do we repeat history, or is it as this pastor out of California, this prominent pastor says, well, it's supposed to get worse. That's what the Bible teaches. It's supposed to get worse. I don't know. Yes, I do. Let me put it to you this way. When a nation, when a people, when an individual has the sovereign God of creation, of salvation, as their God, instead of all the other little gods, things go well. They may have some difficulties, but they go well. And we have seen nations, biblical history, as well as general history, show us that nations that honor and live according to the foundational principles, biblical principles of that God of the universe, of history, things go well. But in this segment, what we're going to talk about is treason in America. Now, over the course of the last little while, I've recommended that you go ahead and get the book. It's a PDF download. You could go to my other programs to find the administrative state of study on the political theory of American public administration. And the rise of the administrator is in here as well. The notion of professionalism or expertise in government service was at first inclusive, undifferentiated, and uncritical until the First Great War. There was, as a rule, simply a strong feeling that business methods ought to be applied to government, that appointments to government positions should be by merit, that we ought to have experts in government service. These notions were undefined and overlapping. They were simply the positive side of the reflection that morality is not enough, and we can no longer allow the politicians to run things as in the past. That's our quandary, right? That's our problem at the moment, is morality is not enough. Yet moral people can't be deterministic in what is right and wrong and what is good for how government should function. Instead, we have to have these experts. That's a joke. Because remember, as I've always said, and others smarter than I, is that Everybody acts from moral determination. Your moral thoughts, your moral political judgments, your political theology is impressed by the experts. So the experts. Now, I found this book interesting. And for those that are listening on the podcast, I'm holding it up for the camera. And this is Treason in America, what Harvard's history books won't tell you. I found it interesting. I think I picked it up for $1 at some used bookstore or something. But it was written by Anton Chaitkin, Chaitkin. Now, you know me very well that I'm not much on modern books, but when I picked this one up and thumbed through it, it was so well documented that it was something that I said, well, I got to take a look at it. This is a study from Aaron Burr to Averell Harriman. Now, in the first segment, you heard that I was saying about the family ties, the intrigue. You look at the Biden family. Hunter now pleads not guilty to the charges that were put before him because his sweetheart deal fell apart, which was good. It was good that the judge paid attention, and not from a prejudicial perspective, but from an understanding of the other potential charges that could come forward against Hunter Biden. And that was the concern with the deal, is that he would be exempted from any other types of charges going forward, that deal would have taken and covered everything in his life forever, which meant the whole Biden crime family forever. Well, it comes to be interesting in that in this book here is that it brings in family ties. It brings in, and I'm not going to try and take you through all of the family ties, but who was Benedict Arnold tied to? So I'm going to ask you a lot of questions, and maybe this will cause you to go pick up the book. Aaron Burr, who was he tied to? I mean, Aaron Burr, let's see, he was at Litchfield Law School. Burr struck up an intense friendship with Dolly Quincy. Oh, interesting. So we're seeing relationship building, and how does that happen and function in the political realm? And we go on to say that Burr, he was there. Then he was the fiancé of Continental Congress leader John Hancock. Miss Quincy was passing the summer at her home of one of Burr's cousin, who was Hancock's friend. When the war broke out in the Lexington and Concord, Aaron Burr went to Philadelphia carrying Dolly's recommendation and secured from John Hancock, by then her husband, a letter of introduction to the commander of the new Continental Army, George Washington. Then Burr went back to Boston, summer of 75, suddenly ablaze with patriotism. Prior to that, he was not. Revere thought that Burr was very basic, that Burr was a student. Paul Revere, established the first law school in America. Tapping Revere, it was Tapping Revere, not Paul Revere, Tapping Revere. Interestingly enough, is that Burr immersed himself into Jonathan Edwards' theological background and what he was teaching, and on it went. And then it goes on to talk about Burr and his other backgrounds and ties into England, Canada, and so on. The idea that political ties develop the intrigue and family relationships, become the oligarchs, become the aristocracy that we first talked about in segment number 1, that the anti-federalist, called The Federalist, was writing about, expecting you to go through and understand history. I highly recommend that we go through and we understand history. The questions that arise in this book are amazing. The questions of who is tied to who, how each family did not necessarily reject all of their ties into England, and more importantly, the tie backs of the Tories. You see, Sam Adams wanted to take away the property of the Tories for not supporting the efforts of independence. He did not think they were worthy to be citizens because they rejected and they held so tight to and fought against. Remember, I talked to you in the first segment, 1/3 were patriots seeking independence. 1/3 were indifferent or were taking advantages of both sides during the war, especially a number of different business people. 1/3 were Tories who were absolutely loyal to those in Great Britain to the extent that they fought against the other third. Sound like today? Sound like today? Sound like the Democrats, the socialists, the communists, and all of that? Well, talk about the socialists and communists. I have to take you to a chapter it's called From the East India Company to Marx. This chapter was one of the most intriguing chapters in this whole book. It takes and it goes through, and quickly here in the last few minutes, from the British East India Company to Emerson, Carlyle, and Marx. It ties through all of the various connections in history and going all the way back to those business oligarchs who were imposing upon America right from the beginning. You have to, I don't know that you recall, and I don't know if you've listened to my programs in relationship to the East India Company being the destroyers of American commerce. They look at the tax on the tea. We were trading with the Dutch, we were trading with the Spanish, we were trading with the French, we were trading directly in so many different ways, but especially with the Dutch when it came to tea. But the East India Company had warehouses full of tea that they could not get into the American market. So what'd they do? They went to Parliament, had the tea tax put on, and as with many other trading concepts, they forced America to trade solely with Great Britain. Geez, no different than today, right? Where is our trade? Our trade is, we have free trade. Free trade comes out of this whole concept. Free trade comes out of the concept of what happened in the East India Company. It actually happened with Frederick Engels, who was the financier. And actually, when you learn here and going back through, I always talk about the Communist Manifesto. It was Engels that wrote it, and then he gave it to Marx to tweak. Karl Marx was a slave of Frederick Engels, who was a great industrialist. And when you go through, and I love this book and its history of how the Engels family actually set up the idea of industrialism, taking and designing the whole idea of communism. Well, we have that today. Globalism, we have that environmentalism, transgenderism, all the other isms. Where's the root? It all goes back to what we said in the first segment on the oligarchs and the aristocrats. But what's most important is you being diligent and fighting for liberty. And it's always going to come down to, who's your God? Who are your gods? Is it the administrative state? Is it the oligarchs? Is it the isms? Or is it the sovereign God of the universe that gives us liberty in Christ? That's our guarantee, is liberty. Come on back next week when Sam Adams, he just continues with those anti-federalists to get it right.